Hi, I'm Neil of Verdant Sculpts, and I make videos about sculpting, molding, and casting. If that sounds like something up your alley, please hit that subscribe button so you can get all of the latest content. Today's video features a very special project, Quasar the Neurodivergent Dragon. As a newly discovered neurodivergent person, I wanted to create a piece based off of the rainbow infinity pride symbol. This project is very close to my heart, and I really hope that you enjoy sharing in its creation. I'm going to be creating a very simple armature for this figure, just really quick. Twist together a aluminum armature wire, and doing that twisting is going to help the clay stick to the wire. I twist out about 6 inches or so, maybe a little longer, and I'm just snipping off the ends. And the measurement I really want to make sure I get right is the size of the figure. Since this is going to be an ornament, I don't want it to get too big and hence too heavy. So I have my ruler out to make sure that I keep it around 3 inches or so. And I'm just bending the form into place, trying to figure out how the overlap of the tail is going to work. The interaction of the head and tail is what's really going to be tricky about this piece. I will be taking more time on the block out of this figure, getting the form right, the balance right, because that's going to be really important to the finished product. So I'm using up some warmed up monster clay. That's an oil-based clay that I use for my molded figures. It is reusable, so once I'm done with this figure, I can melt it down and reuse it in another figure. And I'm just getting the armature covered here. Again, that braided texture of the wire just helps that clay stick right on. And I'm not doing too much as far as bulking out at this point. He's going to be pretty skinny anyway. I'm just really getting in the main shapes to figure out how this pose is going to work. Just kind of roughing in the head, just for reference. Adding a little bit of bulk on the back of the neck. And originally I was looking at pictures of Ouroboros, the serpent with the tail in his mouth. And that's what I was going to do for this originally, was have the tail tuft kind of sticking out the back of his mouth. Eventually I do scrap that, but I was conceptualizing it as I went. And it really wasn't as cut and dry as I thought it was going to be. Since I already had the symbol, all I had to do was make it into a dragon, but I learned that it was a lot more than that. I really had to balance the whole figure and all the elements of it. So you can see I just am figuring out how I want the hands to be positioned. I move them around quite a bit throughout the creation of this. And the mane is another element that I changed quite a bit throughout this. Originally, I was going to have the mane go along the length of the body, which is why I'm marking that center line here. I was going to use that as guidance to do the whole mane. But once I got to the base of the neck, I realized that having a mane along the entire body was just going to look way too busy. So I stopped it there, and I thought that's all I was going to do. But then I started adding the legs on as balance for that opposite side, and I originally didn't like the legs. So I thought to balance the mane on the head, I would go ahead and do another section of mane along the tail. And I'm just using really rough shapes here again, just roughing in that overall shape and position without worrying about detail. Just don't want to spend too much time getting things looking accurate here. I'm really just conceptualizing at this point, trying to figure out that pose. So as you can see, I added the legs back in, ultimately. And I did like them there, just that empty space was just not working for the balance. Now this session here was a few days after that initial blockout. I had this sitting on my desk and he looked way too big. I measured him and he ended up being 4 inches long. Even though I had measured out the length from the start, somehow he just got way too big. And originally I was going to re-sculpt it, but I thought this one was salvageable. Here I am scraping down the neck and replacing the head. I already removed the head. And as I sculpted here, I realized I had just made the front half way too heavy, way too thick. And the head was too big, it was too far down. So it was really just over sculpting that one side that ended up making it too long. So it was ultimately not too difficult to make it a little smaller. Going back and just redoing that head, addressing the legs a little bit. And at this point, I still am of the mindset that I'm going to have the tail in his mouth. Other than that, I'm pretty happy with the pose overall at this point. So I start adding in secondary details along the face, like the eyes here. And I use ball bearings for the eyes. If you've watched my other videos, you're familiar with that. It just makes it easier to sculpt around versus using clay. I cut open the mouth here so I could put the tail in his mouth. And this is where I started realizing that this just was not going to work. Of course, I tried as hard as I can because in my head it just looked so cute, but sometimes you gotta scrap those ideas when they don't pan out the way you want them to. Ripping that head off again and starting a new one. It was just such a mess from trying to get the tail in the mouth and all of that, so I just opted to start from scratch, which was a good idea. It looks pretty good there. You see I wrapped the tail around his back, which ended up looking really good for the infinity look. And now it's time to start refining some more now that I've got the pose and balance looking pretty good. I like to use loop tools to slowly pare down the shape. Getting those eyes back in. That little wire loop tool is my favorite go-to tool. I use it for just about everything. You'll see me using it a lot on this piece. Carving in the mouth and nostrils there. And building up the eye ridge, the cheekbone, and the forehead here with little strips of clay. That wire loop tool is great for defining around the eyes. Keeping my touch really light on the clay, I really try to touch the clay as little as possible, as strange as that may sound. Adding on the horns here, growing out the back of his head. I'm just using my finger and the metal loop tool to blend them in. This was really such a fun figure to make because I didn't have any pre-existing design or parameters to follow. Right here I'm testing out some scales, letting myself think of what I want to do later on. Like, I'm not ready for the scale detail there, but just having that idea in my mind helps me sculpt the rest of the figure. So I'm getting that mane back in. Now I'm going about it a little differently this time, sculpting the texture in as I place the segments or clumps of hair along the back of his neck. Now I am getting ready to set the belly scales in. So first drawing in the outline of where those scales are going to go, especially since I've got that twist in the back there. Want to make sure that the scales are flowing in the right direction so it looks like he's actually twisting in the middle there. Doing little twists like that is kind of tricky. I'm just following the curve with my tool and drawing in that outline area. And now that I've got the outline in, I can go and tool in the individual scales. Making sure that the line work lines up on either side. You don't want them to be crooked. And these scale lines I end up going over and smoothing probably a dozen times. I don't show even half of it on this video. All the scale work in general is extremely cut down, that they take quite a while to sculpt. I knew I wanted this to be really ornate looking so I could get gold details on the scales, and for that it was important to do individual scales. I'd removed the arms while I was sculpting the belly scales. Made it a lot easier, and I just put them back on there. And now it is finally time to start laying in those body scales. Just one at a time. This wire loop tool is really great for scales. It keeps a nice soft edge on them. And it's also great for paring away small areas like the arm that was a little too bulky there. And defining the anatomy details. Doing the other arm at the same time so they look nice and even. adding in those teeny tiny little fingers, just with rolled up little pieces of clay that I attach individually to the hand and smooth them in with my tool. Very carefully, I pinch little claws on the tips of each finger. Only 2 fingers on this guy. Just way too small to do more than that. But it works really well for the design. And the feet get the same treatment. Little clawed toes. And now moving over to the tail tuft and adding some hair detail in that, as well as adding some strips of clay to bulk it out, add a little variation. And continuing that scale work. Doing it one segment at a time, as I still have other details to work on the figure, so I want to make sure that I'm not erasing that scale detail accidentally when I'm gripping the figure. And just notice that I'm following the flow of the figure when I'm doing the scale work. Really adds to the movement of this piece. And some teeny tiny scales on the arms. Adding a little bulk on the feet there. They were looking a little bit flat. So I'm getting very close to being done. Just adding the final scale work. Doing the detailing on the rest of the mane. And this video will not show the final smoothing process, as that's going to be tied into the molding process, so we will see that in a later video. And unfortunately, I was so excited to move on to the next step, I completely forgot to do turnaround videos of this clay sculpture. Not the first time I've done that, and it certainly won't be the last, so I'm going to put together a little montage here of photos and videos of the finished resin cast, so you can get an idea of what it looked like when I was done. But for now, that is it for this video. If you got something out of this video, I would appreciate a thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.